Now, before we get into the actual video, I need to give you a pretty large disclaimer. I want to tell you that this build is not easy to league start. This is a build that is very complicated, it's difficult to play, and there are lots of issues that you could run into if you play this build. It is very powerful. It can do pretty much all content in the game, it scales extremely well, and it should have a relatively straightforward path to being able to get there. However, I cannot say this enough. If you are a new player, if you are even an above average player, this is probably not a build that is going to work for you, and I need you to trust me on that. I don't want to hear a single one of you down in the comments being like, oh, I league started this build and my wife left me, I got cancer and my legs don't work anymore, I'm financially ruined and I can't play PoE ever again because of this build. I hate you, big ducks. How dare you hold a gun to my head and make me play this build? I don't want to hear a single one of you, okay? Not a single one. I don't want to hear any of that down in the comments, okay? I've given you your warning. Now let's get into the video. So if you're still here, you made it through the disclaimer, you decided that you are going to play the best build imaginable, the Nova Spellslinger Fanaticism build. Not the best build imaginable, but the idea here is that we are going to be making a transition from one build into another build, and I'm going to describe exactly how to do that transition. Let's talk a little bit about the build as a whole first, though. This is something that you're going to have to create a little bit of a currency with an initial build and transition into this one. However, this is going to be my league starter, this is my plan, this is what I'm going to be doing, what I'm going to be pushing for, so I thought some of you guys would be interested in hearing about it. So what is this build? This is a build that utilizes Fanaticism. This is a keystone from the Inquisitor that hasn't gotten a lot of love pretty much ever. The only person that I've seen really use this besides for this build was like I saw Mathel try to make use of it one time, and that didn't even look that great, but regardless, I found a way to make it sort of work. The idea here is that we are spell slinging Frostbolt, that is giving us the attack that we need for Fanaticism, and then we are self-casting Ice Nova. The idea is that keeping up the Fanaticism buff means that most of our abilities are essentially free. So this allows us to do a bunch of cool stuff like cast as quickly as we want on our main ability. It allows us to use things like Blessings with Hatred. It allows us to do a whole bunch of cool stuff, but that is the main gist of the ability. That's the main idea of the build. We're abusing Fanaticism to be able to cast as much as we want, as quickly as we want, and not really have to worry about mana. Now, beyond this, beyond the damage that we're doing, we are also going to be a low-life Petrified Blood build that focuses on block, spell block, a bunch of recovery, we've got a decent amount of armor, and a lot of maximum resistances. So our defensive layers are there. It's relatively tanky, it's got very good recovery, and if you turn off your Righteous Fire, you've got insane recovery. Righteous Fire is just like essentially a cooldown that you can use to do big damage to bosses. I leave it on pretty much all the time whenever I'm, just running around through maps, and kind of turn it off during dangerous phases of bosses most of the time. And the way that you turn it off is you just set one of your flasks to be a immunity to ignite suffix. You've probably seen some footage in the background right now that is just the build running around, killing some bosses, doing some various stuff. That is how the build looks when you're playing it. However, keep in mind that there are a bunch of things going on in the stuff that you see in the background. A lot of buttons being pressed, there's a lot of different abilities being used, and this is with me having a little bit of experience with the build. Build's pretty difficult to play, but if you have ever played like a Warcry build before or anything like that, you should be able to handle something like this build. So let's begin by talking about how I'm going to actually league start, how I'm going to make my currency, and when I'm going to make the transition, and then what I'm going to do with it. So we are going to be playing an RF Inquisitor build. This is just going to be Pohx's version of it. As you might know, it's a very, very good version of the RF build. Pohx has basically been playing RF for a very, very, very long time. Someone in my chat, I think, said it best. Pohx has probably forgotten more things about RF than most people know about RF total. Very, very solid build that's going to be linked down in the description. I'm going to be playing with this initially. So the idea here is that you level with Freezing Pulse. As soon as you're able to get Wintertide Brand at level 12, you swap to Wintertide Brand. Wintertide Brand is going to take you all the way up to like 55 or so, meaning that's going to be when you get your second Ascendancy. As you can see here, our second Ascendancy is Pious Path. What this is going to allow us to do is it's going to mean that we just have Consecrated Ground essentially permanently, and this allows us to get both life and energy shield recovery, and it gives us a little bit of increased effectiveness of that as well. On top of that, Sanctuary is going to make it so that Consecrated Ground is around you while you're stationary. This is the other half of us having perma-consecrated ground. And if you're standing on top of things, they take 15% increased damage taken, so that's pretty good. Now this build can get you all the way through most of the game, up into doing some early bossing as well. Now, I am going to transition out of this build as soon as I get money, but the way that I'm going to be making that money is I'm going to be doing Heist. The cool thing about RF is that this is a build that can become insanely tanky. It doesn't do a ton of damage, but it is quite fast because you can move around using shield charge and you can just invest heavily into movement speed, and it does damage around you while you're moving. Those are all perfect things that you would want for a heist farmer. So here's the play. I'm going to be using Pohx's RF guide to get up to probably about 75 into some low tier yellows, and then I'm going to be transitioning full time into heist. I'm going to be pushing through heist, leveling up in heist, just buying heist contracts from either like my viewers over my Twitch stream at twitch.tv/BigDucks, which you should go follow by the way, or from TFT or from the website, wherever else that I can get them, right? I'm going to be doing that, and then I'm going to be running a bunch of contracts, getting a bunch of the items from heist, transitioning into some blueprints, running some blueprints, getting all the money that I need to craft the items to transition into my final build, which is going to be the Ice Nova Inquisitor that we were talking about. So that's my plan for getting currency, getting everything together, and moving into that build. Now, if you didn't want to be doing a heist strategy early on, you are by no means obligated to do a heist strategy to pull this off. The way that you can do this is that if you want to just go and get into some early map farming, get up into red tier maps, maybe even some like higher tier red maps, follow Pohx's guide to get up to that point and just farm those maps. You can follow my guide from a couple videos ago talking about my Atlas strategy that you can use to figure out whatever it is that you want to do. Just pump a whole bunch of stuff into your maps, get some like essences and strongbox and maybe some other things. You can even leave the heist contracts and blueprints and stuff in there, so you can use that as part of something that you can do, which is a pretty good idea. That's what I'm going to be doing. And you can just farm some maps. You can even do expedition if you want to. This isn't the greatest build for expedition, but it will work. Farm up until you have enough money to transition into the final build, which is the Ice Nova Inquisitor. This is the build that you saw in the background, and it's what I'm mainly going to be talking about in this video. Now, I'm going to cover all of the basics as best as I can, but if you're interested in seeing the absolute nitty-gritty of what this build is capable of, you want to see like a really long, drawn out video with all of the endgame bosses and a whole bunch of farming and a whole bunch of cool stuff, you can go watch the video. It's up in the top right corner now. That is my guide from 3.17 about when I actually played this build. Got everything in it, but we're going to go over all of the stuff that you need to know to be able to play this, starting with the abilities. So, as I said previously, the way that this build works is that we are going to be spell slinging with Frenzy. We're using the Frenzy ability here, both to generate Frenzy charges as well as just our main attack that we're able to use with our wand to proc our Spell Slinger. We've got a Spell Slinger going here. This Spell Slinger is going to be casting Frostbolt. Now, Frostbolt is just a delivery system for our main ability, which is going to be Ice Nova. The idea here is that you are able to cast Ice Nova off of your own character, and that works perfectly fine if you have enough mana to do it. You're able to cast Ice Nova off of your main character. However, if you do cast a Frostbolt and you click on that Frostbolt, you can cast an Ice Nova off of the Frostbolt, and this has two main advantages. One, it can cast multiple times off of that area, and you can do, say, a ranged ability. And two, you are not locked in place from Spell Echo. So the idea here is that we can use Spell Echo support with our main Ice Nova ability. We can cast as many times as we want, and the Spell Echo will simply happen without us being locked in place, being forced to cast it. This allows us to cast a ton of Ice Novas when we get our things going. You'll notice that after I get this Fanaticism buff here, you see the Fanatic charges. We get the Fanaticism buff going, we are able to absolutely spam this Ice Nova, like a ton of them per second, a ridiculous amount. This is the main way that we actually deal our damage. Now beyond that, we have a couple additional abilities. We're using Vortex. The main reason that we're using Vortex is for Bone Chill support. This is just to get us some extra damage taken from enemies. So the idea is that when you're fighting bosses and such, you can pop some Vortexes out of these Frostbolts underneath the enemy and do some extra damage to them. Beyond that, when we do have our Fanaticism up, we are able to use a Blessing with Hatred. This is going to mean that we're just going to do a bunch of extra damage. It's pretty easy to keep this up pretty much constantly since it's almost free while Fanaticism is up. We use Shield Charge to move around, and to keep our Fanaticism stacks up, you might notice that we get Fanatic charges because we are attacking with Shield Charge. And then we have Flame Dash to go over gaps, as well as Molten Shell on our left click and Vol Molten Shell as kind of oh no, I'm taking a lot of damage button. We've got all of our auras. We use quite a few of them. We do use Determination for armor, Petrified Blood because this is a low life build. We use Vitality. This is to gain us a bunch of recovery. Vitality is very, very powerful for low life Petrified Blood builds because it basically gets double effectiveness. We have Spell Slinger, Zealotry just because it's a good aura, Purity of Elements to make us completely elemental ailment immune, as well as Tempest Shield. It gives us some spell block as well well as some chance to shock enemies, which is pretty good. And beyond that, we do have our curse, which we are going to be self-casting. Assassin's Mark is the curse that we use to cap out our crit chance, as well as give us a chance to gain power charges when we're fighting difficult enemies. The thing about marks nowadays is that they're permanent, so I feel it's not that big of a deal to just self-cast this on bosses and such. You can self-cast it on the boss and it stays there pretty much forever, so that's not a big deal for me. The other ability we have here is Righteous Fire. Now, Righteous Fire is a big damage bonus. However, you don't need to keep it on all the time. I use it most of the time. I don't really think about it too much, except for like on very difficult boss encounters. So I just kind of keep this up, and if I feel that I'm in danger, I simply am going to use my Life Flask, which removes all burning when used. That will turn off the Righteous Fire and give you a ton of recovery. We're going to gain the full power of all of our recovery. Now, as a final side tangent, you might notice that there is an Animate Guardian running around me. This is a very, very high end. You can only really do this at the very, very top end. It is very powerful. I do recommend it if you can get all of the gear for it, but it's very, very difficult to get it going. The TLDR of this is that to have this Animate Guardian functioning, you're going to need an Ashes of the Stars, you're going to need Divergent Animate Guardian, you're going to need a Hungry Loop with a level 3 in power, 20 meat shield, 20 elemental army support, and 20 minion life in that Hungry Loop. Put it into there, and then the gear that you're going to need for this character is a Mask of the Stitch Demon. You're going to need a Garb of the Ephemeral that has an implicit with gained life as maximum energy shield, as well as like the Kingmaker and all the other normal stuff for it. And then on top of that on the tree, you're going to have to take these 3 nodes here. You might be asking me, is all of that really worth it? Yeah, it is. This is going to make it so that you are completely immune to all stuns, all slows, all action speed things that like slow your character down to a crawl, meaning like the Elder Suck, as well as the Grasping Hands from Delirium. It's also going to give you 10 stacks of Fortify. That means just 10% less damage taken from hits. It's also going to give you Culling Strike and Crit Strike Multiplier. It's pretty solid. It really is good. He is killable. The Animate Guardian can die, but the only thing that I've really seen that can kill the Animate Guardian is when I'm in like 60 to 80% delirious juice to the absolute teeth maps. And that is from like beyond mobs doing like all kinds of crazy corpse explosions and things like that. Corpse explosion chests can also do some damage to him, but the main thing that kills him, the closest that he's ever got to death was when I was doing Simulacrum. I've made it to like wave 25 or 26 with this build in Simulacrum. I simply have not invested enough money to do enough damage, and I can't get this build any tankier than it already is, but I got to like wave 26 or 27, I think is the best I've ever done. That's the idea behind the Animate Guardian. You don't have to use them. You can just copy another ring like this. It just has like cast speed and resist and life, and that's more than enough. That is all of the abilities that you're going to be using on the finalized version of this build. Let's talk about the gear. The gear is pretty big. The gear is pretty important. Now, there is a budget version of this build. I don't actually think it's that good. I think that the full end version of this is much better, but if you absolutely cannot stand saying RF for any longer, you can transition into the budget version. It is not even close to as good. It's okay, but it's not even close to as good. You've been warned. That's linked down in the description. I'll talk about it more when we get into the section with POB. Now, for the finalized version of the build, there are a couple items that are necessary, as well as one that is just really good to have. 2 items that you absolutely have to have for the finalized version of the build to work is the crafted helmet. This is going to be the main thing that allows us to do most of our damage. It's the thing that frees us from having to have a 6-link chest piece. It means that we can get more abilities into the build, which we need as many as we possibly can, and it does mean that we are going to do a ton more damage. Now, the Hitch Treat Cold Resistance is 10% higher than actual value is completely ignored because we are an Inquisitor, and we get the node here that says when we crit, we completely ignore elemental resistances, so this is perfectly fine. The other piece of gear is 2 pieces of gear, actually. I kind of lied to you. It is Forbidden Flesh, Forbidden Flame with Instruments of Zeal. This might be super expensive, it might be super cheap. I paid 5 Exalt for it when I paid for it in the league here, but that's just because pretty much no one was putting them up. I don't know how expensive it's going to be. I could not tell you. I have no clue whatsoever. Once you have those 2 pieces of gear, you are able to play the build. The third piece of gear that is very, very good and makes everything much easier is going to be Ashes of the Stars, of course. Beyond that, the rest of the gear isn't as important. We've just got a wand that has like a bunch of good stats, plus the level of cold skills, and as well as cast speed and such. We've got a shield build, this has cold damage, life gain when you block, as well as maximum fire resist. If you can't get a max fire resist and life when you block shield, you can use a life when you block, ES when you block shield. You can kind of use an Awakener's Orb to put those together, but the maximum fire resist is quite nice. I could keep crafting the shield if I want to get +1 to cold gems. That would probably be another 40 Exalt to be able to get that done, so it's kind of expensive. The chest piece, this is something that you can craft. The main reason that we use this chest piece is for the +1 level of all Vol skill gems. Our Ice Nova is an anomalous Vol Ice Nova, so we get +1 from that. You will be able to find crafting information for all of this gear in the notes of the POB, so check that out if you're interested in how to craft any of this kind of stuff. It's going to be pretty much necessary because no one will be making this gear. And then we've got just a random ring. We've got some gloves that have like dexterity, resistance is life, some resistances, and then we have a Tailwind Elusive Onslaught boots. You could just use normal boots with like resistances, life, and movement speed on here, but these are relatively straightforward to make these days, and if you've got the money, you should probably be making a pair of boots like these. For the flasks, we are using a Quicksilver, a Ruby, a Amethyst, as well as a Granite flask. You use the enchantments with used when charges reach full on all 4 of these, and you use gain charges when you're hit by an enemy. You will essentially have infinite flasks. And then on your life flask, make sure that you've got one that says removes all burning when used. The prefix is not as important. You're mainly trying to remove the Righteous Fire so that your recovery can come into effect. Beyond that, we do have some just standard jewels besides the Forbidden Flesh, Forbidden Flame. The main one being a just cold damage, crit multiplier, as well as life, as many of those jewels as you can fit into it. Doesn't really matter what else is on there. You can get stats and resistances here as well if you need. We are using a Watcher's Eye. This is a particular Watcher's Eye that's got increased critical strike chance against enemies on consecrated ground. We do create a lot of consecrated ground, so this helps us cap our crit chance out. We also have gain Arcane Surge for 4 seconds when you create consecrated ground, which we create consecrated ground constantly, so we pretty much always have Arcane Surge. The rest of it doesn't really matter that much. This combination was really cheap. There's some better ones out there, but that's the main idea of the Watcher's Eye. And then of course the Forbidden Flesh, Forbidden Flame, and the Cluster Jewel that we've got here. We're using a large Cluster Jewel which has Mage Hunter, Practice Caster, and Sap Psyche. You are going to need to go into POB and see which particular jewels have the right setup here. I just got a caster jewel because this was the easiest way to set this up. The idea is you want to make it so that you don't need to take this outer node. This outer node does almost nothing for us. We just want the practice caster as well as the mage hunter. And then we're just putting our jewels in here, as well as our zealotry has increased mana reservation efficiency and our mana reservation efficiency small cluster. Now, if I got a few more levels on this build, I would put in another small cluster jewel here. I don't actually know where it is. It's probably somewhere in the mess that is my stash, but that is going to provide us endurance charges whenever we block. That's the basics of the gear. That's the basics of the skills. If you want significantly more in-depth information about how all the mechanics work and how we sustain like our RF and all those other kinds of things, once again, that video that I linked earlier, my full in-depth guide on this particular build is available. You can go and check that out. But for now, we're going to quickly jump into the POB so I can kind of give you an idea of what's going on with these POBs and how to read them and how to use them. All right, so here is the situation with the path of buildings that are going to be linked down in the description. You're going to find 3 path of buildings linked down there. The first one is going to be a link to Pohx's RF Inquisitor build. This is the build that you're going to start with. I didn't feel that I could bring anything to the RF Inquisitor that Pohx has not already done for it. There was someone in my chat the other day that said something that I basically felt was the truth, is that Pohx has forgotten more things about RF Inquisitor and just Righteous Fire in general than most people ever learn about Righteous Fire, so just go follow his guide. There's nothing that I can do that's going to make it better than what it already is. It's very smooth. I've tested it from start all the way up into maps. It worked perfectly fine. I had no issues. But then you're going to see 2 other POBs. There's going to be the standard Ice Nova POB that we'll talk about in a moment, but there's also going to be this budget POB. If you absolutely cannot handle playing RF any longer and you want to be able to transition into a budget version of this build, just be warned, it's not that good. It does function. You can do maybe about 3 million DPS, but it's not going to be as tanky. It's not going to do as much damage. It's just not going to be as good in general. Not going to function like it's supposed to. It doesn't have the amount of recovery that the other build has. It doesn't have any of that, right? It'll still work. It'll still function, but it's not as good. This version of the build is not using the crafted helmet. It's not using anything that's crazy. It doesn't have the Forbidden Flesh, Forbidden Flame that you need for the Instruments of Zeal, meaning you're not getting Sanctuary, you're not getting Pious Path, and you can't use Righteous Fire. So all of that is out the window when you're using this basic version of it. But if you absolutely cannot handle playing RF any longer, you can swap into this, but you have been warned. As for the finalized version here, you'll notice that the damage is much higher. We've got closer to 15 million DPS with the gear. This does have the gear that my character was using. You can find all of that here if you're interested in what gear was being used in the video. If you want to know, like, you know, the amount of gear that you need to get the same effect from like the video and such that I had before. This also does have like a super min-maxed version of the gear. This is going to be like extremely expensive expensive items. They're not completely min-max, but a lot of this gear is going to be almost unobtainable. This is like 100 to 200 exalt worth of items. My gear, with average luck on crafting, probably about 25 to 30 exalt, roughly. But that is for everything. For the basics of what you need to begin playing the build, I'd say probably 10, maybe 11, maybe a little bit more than that. Depends on how expensive Ashes of the Stars is, and how expensive the Forbidden Flesh, Forbidden Flame ends up being. We'll have to see, I have no idea. But beyond that, the tree that is in here is going to be my finalized tree. There is a level 100 tree that does give you that little rote reinforcement node that I was talking to you about before, but you're only really going to be transitioning into this tree at like 95 or 90 plus at least, so there's not really going to be any leveling stuff in here. You have to use Pohx's guide for RF for that. Got all of the skills that you need. It'll let you know like which alt qualities that you should use, where you should place them, what you should link, and all those kinds of things. It's got the 2 item sets that I talked about before. The configuration is set up to be for a boss at the end of a map. This is stuff that you should be able to all have going if you're playing the build properly. And then the most important part here is going to be the notes. I've spent a decent amount of time making sure that these notes have everything that you need. It's got anything from like warnings to make sure, you know, hey, don't play this build if you're not good. Don't play this build if you don't know how to make currency. It's got an introduction talking about how the build scales defenses, how the build scales damage, ratings on the build, what I think about it, how difficult it is to play, what it's good at, what it's bad at, how to set up the configuration, alt quality gems, the frequently asked questions, as well as how to level it up, general playstyle, which you should just watch the video, by the way, talking about the Animate Guardian and the gear that I use for it, and ultimately how to craft all of the important pieces of gear. If you are not able to craft, I don't suggest that you play this build. You need to be able to have some crafting knowledge to be able to get any of this gear, because no one else is going to have it, because no one else is going to be playing this build. And that is going to be it for the video. Now, I know I didn't go super in depth with a lot of stuff here. You do have that alternative guide that you can look at if you really need to see some very, very in-depth information here. But if you are the kind of player that needs all that extra information and doesn't really understand how this is working, this probably isn't a build that you should be playing. But it's going to be my league start. It should be a lot of fun. We'll see how it goes. I have no idea. I think that it'll go pretty well, but you know, that's for me, not for you. Remember, boys, if you're enjoying this content, give this video a like, subscribe to the YouTube channel, hit that notification bell to stay up to date with all the latest videos, and stay safe out there in Ray class. And I'll see you guys in 3.18 Sentinel League.